Assalamu alaikum, everybody. As per Salman mentioned, this is a book which is a comparative study between Islam and liberalism. And this tries to be, it is not the first time somebody has really talked about comparing these two philosophies or worldviews, you may call it. I think what Professor Kraminski is trying to do is instead of trying to be, just blind about the other, he tries to be more sort of evaluative in what the other looks like, and focuses really about on a more thorough comparative approach in the entire process. I think the third bit of the title is ontology. Just to very briefly set the tone of the conversation, I'm sure this audience is well aware of that such terms, but for the sake of our presentation today, it's worth revisiting. Ontology is about claims about reality in terms of what exists, and also what are the nature of things within those existence and what relationships they share with each other. So he's really trying to compare these two worldviews, so to speak, from a very foundational layer, where trying to assess them from what is the basis of, how do they see reality at large, and what are the consequences of that seeing or those basic assumptions about nature of things that can emerge from thereafter. What is the structure of the book? The book basically starts by first spending quite a bit of time talking about liberalism and its origins, and where it started, primarily in Enlightenment. Then also tries to really cover different forms of liberalisms, because liberalism itself has gone through, you could say, evolution or change, or is largely fluidic, and it's difficult to really capture in a particular box, so to speak. So for the sake of comprehensiveness, he's trying to give us a view of what liberalisms are and what forms in which they exist or have existed. Post that, where he really starts the distinction or comparative aspect of the book, which is first of all around being moral epistemology, which is the question of how do we know what is good, or how do we know what is right within these two frameworks, and subsequently role of religion in public sphere, and of course law also. The author does go further down and draws further conclusions in terms of what could be a more comprehensive or what philosophy could align better with Islam as compared to liberalism. But I think in today's conversation, we will not touch that. We will be really focused on, I would say, the first three aspects of this section. So this is the main crux. The investigation is about understanding what are the fundamental distinctions and baseline assumptions between Islam and liberalism. And he says that it is this fundamental distinction which is the truth, and any overlaps or commonalities or any attempts to find reconciliation between two is only incidental, and it actually has failed. And that's how the book starts as well, actually, where he goes on to talk about there has been an early attempt to reconcile Islam and liberalism. And this has started, or at least liberal values, this has started from the dawn of Ottoman Empire. And there have been actors like Jamaluddin al-Afghani or Muhammad Abdu and other actors further down the line who have tried to, you could say, ape or try to get inspired from liberal aspects or liberal values, and they have assumed that maybe if you were to adopt those values, we could regain a lost glory of sorts. And somebody tried to do that on an administrative level. Somebody tried to do that on the try to really go on the metaphysical aspect of it, to really drop on the liberty that apparently liberalism offers. But the author ultimately concludes that, in post 9/11, there was a massive change where we saw, first of all, liberal critique of Islam and Islam apologetics defending itself against the same. And since there hasn't been any real work to really fairly compare the two in a more holistic sense, and this is where the work really sits, is a fair comparison of both these worldviews or philosophies. Let's start with liberalism and its origins. Liberalism was born in Enlightenment origins, which is to say that there were dark ages in Europe, and then came Enlightenment, which basically helped Europe come out of its own dark ages. But what is funny about this nomenclature of dark ages is as if we always see or tend to assume this is a universal phenomena. And this is where the book really, kicks in and really draws in to say, hey, you know what, this is not really universal at large. This phenomena of dark ages and the context within which liberalism emerged is a very European phenomena. It's a European experience. And yeah, that's a broad, I would say, outline of this section. Let's look at what happens, right? So we're talking about there was an oppressive Catholic Church, and there were a lot of feudal lords sitting underneath the kings, for example, which led to a lot of conflict on the ground. Of course, that also would, I would say, increased by a lot of economic crisis as well on the ground, which led to, let's say, a lot of peasant revolts on the ground, and that kept ongoing. On the other end, there was also, I would say, Martin Luther's disenchantment with the Catholic Church, where um, most of the authority was vested with the church itself. And Martin Luther King almost was the first one to really speak of secularity in that sense, where he tried to really curtail the divinely guided right for the king to rule, where he wanted to really, allow people to rule themselves. And he states that there are two regions: what belongs to God be ruled by God, what belongs to Caesar be ruled by Caesar, is the philosophy where he think eventually he proposes from where secularism emerges. The entire process of there were almost hundreds or 120 years of war, which ultimately culminated into Peace of Westphalia, which was a treaty where finally Catholic Church gave away, and there was factioning of the Catholic Church or Catholic Europe, and acceptance of Protestantism and Calvinism. There's an interesting story of how Martin Luther King, dealt with the situation and how he rallied certain kings within the Holy Roman Empire, so to speak, to really accept Protestantism, and that also allowed for sort of this factioning of Catholic Europe. And this is where a lot of this context or birth of enlightenment is happening. Post that, as I said, it was Martin Luther who was the first to lay this foundation of secularism, where he tried to separate the church and state. Beyond that, it was Hugo Grotius who, for the first time, proposed a non-Christian basis of law, and this was the first step towards birth of an inalienable rights which even God could not take away. And instead of revelation, there was an epistemic shift, so to speak, or the shift in how we arrive at laws. So instead of revelation, for the first time, it was kind of reason was being used to arrive at certain laws, so to speak, where which can be used to govern society at large. There were some other actors as well, like for example, D. Vettel, who was an international lawyer, and he worked on rights of citizens in states. And once this, you could say, prior world of kingdoms and or subjects of kings and kingdoms were existing, Vattel perhaps is also attributed to be amongst the first one to give rise to a modern understanding of nation state and nationalism, and also certain rights of citizens within that. In fact, his influence is so much that even today, the basis for conscription laws in America is inspired or is taken from D. Vattel's work. So, I mean, when in this crisis, there's an epistemic shift. We see an arrival of modernity. We see a birth of secularism, and we see an epistemic shift that is happening basis that. So man is no longer living in this enchanted world, which is, I would say, it's a kingdom of God, which is almost, animated by the different spirits that exist around us. And there's a shift of where the world is starting to become more mechanistic, where the world is more tameable, more readable. You can assess the world through understanding cause and effect, and ultimately conquer it and become the master of the world yourself. So this is the broad shift within which liberalism is emerging. It's a shift in previous ways of governing, previous ways of being. It's a shift in previous ways of arriving at laws, and ultimately it's a shift in how we see the world and reality at large, within which liberalism emerges, so to speak. Secularism has been integral to liberalism. That's one of the core arguments the author makes in this book. So what is secularism? Secularism is the separation of church and state, right? That's how we broadly understand it. Even if secularism has been promoted or has been pushed across, uh, it hasn't necessarily led to a more secular society. We can see these examples, for example, in India and Russia as well, right? We have been a secular state for a very long time, but we're seeing that uptake of religiosity hasn't necessarily gone down. And there have been some arguments where um, uh, or assumptions that maybe in post-modernity is when religiosity will pass away. In fact, that has led to, even the book states, the increase in occult and other forms of alternate religions have emerged, in fact, in that phenomena. On the other hand, secularization is another process altogether, where it tries to carve out secular spheres out of religious spheres, for example. So previously, for example, homosexuality was banned or critiqued on the basis of Bible or on the basis of biblical source of that law, right? That God has God has banned man from engaging in such acts. Now the entire conversation has shifted into a conversation of human rights and individual autonomy. So instead of relying on that source, which is originally understood to be a source of law, which was the Bible itself, the Western Hemisphere chose to go to change the source of in how it arrives at these laws, is one such example of secularization, where a society which relied on different means to arrive at those solutions now change its means to arrive at the same now. There are also other examples the author cites. For example, Christian symbols in the West are merely seen as a historical symbol of the historical past. And there are a couple of cases that he cites actually in almost modern America and one in Canada, where there is a cross being placed in these two areas. And in both such cases, the way the jury passes the jurisdiction saying, hey, you know what, they simply represent our culture and history and has nothing to do with religion. And the case was being fought on those grounds. Hey, if we are a secular society, how could we have a religious symbol in public spaces? So if you see the way it's recalled or the way it's justified, justification is not a religious justification. The justification is, a cultural or a historical justification for the same. And secularization could also be seen as something that happens in institutes. How do we arrive at laws? How do we govern ourselves? The basis of those cannot be religion, so to speak. And there have been other critiques the user also cites of secularism. In specific, he talks about Talal Asad's critique of secularism, where he says that it almost creates this binary of rational and material world versus immaterial and supernatural world, where it basically denotes a specific value to the material world being true, while it defaults the supernatural as to be mythical or some sort of pink elephant that you can imagine in your head as falsehood. So it creates this sort of almost an axiomatic starting points from which we start to think about the world in these ways. It may not be something, as actors or participants in this secular societies, if one was to think of ourselves, of how we start to behave on these lines or think on these lines, is that we ourselves, the way we reason, the way we think, our intuitions are almost built in these ways, where almost some things are more rational and some things are not discussed, often in those ways as well. He also, Talal Asad also talks about very interesting thing, that secularism claims of toleration, and he says it falls flat on its face because it actually just creates a new terrain of conflict. It doesn't get away with it. And he cites example of the 9/11 case. For example, if it was a Muslim, a minority, he's seen as a terrorist, and his religious identity is to be blamed. But if there was a Christian terrorist, for example, participating in such an act, which has been the case, and recently, in fact, yesterday itself, we heard a case in Germany, if I can recall, nobody would really cite atheistic reasons in that society because that's the majoritarian place. That's the majoritarian worldview or, religiosity, you may call it, in this case. But atheism will never be questioned or never be called to court for being a cause for such an act. So this is the kind of new terrain that he talks about, where it almost becomes that the dominant religion is able to make a comeback in the public space even if it comes through a different means, right? For example, the case of abortion in America. The conversation of abortion in America, which was recently brought into public space, was not a conversation about if this is a biblically prohibited and biblically accepted or not. It became a debate of pro-choice and pro-life, but eventually, which means that it was discussed in a within a secular reason. But although we saw that the dominant religion was able to make a comeback in the public space, and the same can be said, much can be said about India as well in this context, where the majoritarian religion is able to push boundaries and shape narratives, and by having their actors, and eventually having policies that are in their favor. And just to broadly say, what is liberalism got to do with it? I'm talking about secularism, which is separation of church and state, which is about disenchanting the world from the higher above, or from the metaphysical world. It's almost like a break off, that society is not concerned about the question of God anymore. It cares about governing itself. Well, it is within this void that secularism creates, of breaking off the higher above, the metaphysical, the need to rely upon God and God-given revelation, is the void within which secularism comes to emerge and creates a new ways of imagining the self, new ways of looking at the human being itself, new ways of defining the relationship between these human beings, that is the society at large, and new ways of governing itself, and new ways of arriving at those tools of governance or laws of governance, so to speak. So if it were not to be for secularism, or for this disenchantment, or for this break-off, liberalism perhaps could not have been able to establish itself without this negation of the religious grounding in which the pre-modern world was based off. The author, to be honest, spends a considerable amount of time really focusing on liberalism, because I think it, to me, it was also useful, because we are so, at least I was so uneducated about this context. I found it very useful, and it did so. The other interesting tidbits I thought was very powerful was that Islam and Europe have a 1,000-year-old history, and he cites various examples to really call that out. The first one being that it was Charlemagne, the first Roman emperor, which was uniting the Christian kingdoms or fiefdoms together, and is called the father of Europe. And this unification happened by positing Islam as the enemy. By positing this other, the self was identified, the new self, the European self was identified by seeing this other Islam, which was a threat of all sorts, perhaps. The other aspect, which is, I think, a very powerful takeaway, which I would really want to emphasize, and maybe we can discuss this further in our Q&A, is Europe and Enlightenment creates a different, it changes the notion of space and time as well, where time is now arrived for Europe. Europe has become developed, and the time for the other nations or other places, which were not nations yet perhaps, has not arrived yet. So still developing, they're still underdeveloped. It becomes the reference point. It becomes the golden, whatever you call it, the thing to look up to, the place to arrive at, and the time to arrive at. And it's funny that it defines time in this way, because this time of dark ages is also the same time in Islam as having its golden age. So it's almost as if this Enlightenment moment is universalizing the European experience to the world, and it's passing on its own trauma to the world, and it's saying, hey, you were also in the dark ages, so let us come and enlighten you as well. And of course, there has been a significant amount of justification that Europe and European Enlightenment thinkers have given for colonialism, other kinds of imperial activity that were conducted post this Enlightenment era as well. And this notion of time is not the Quranic notion of time, which is also an interesting aspect. Enlightenment builds upon a modern time. Modern time is about breaking off from tradition. So the past is mythical, is not so useful. There is always this optimistic future we must look up to, we must aspire towards. Unlike the Quranic time, where the best of the person happened to arrive on earth 1400 years ago, and the best of the people were the Salaf. And the time in the Quran is cyclical. I think I recall Professor Ahmed talking about this notion of cyclicality of time, where they will be, the Prophet Muhammad was the best of man. Nobody will be able to arrive at his place. He is Insan Kamil. The Salaf were after. There is going to be a degeneration, and then comes revival. It is also said one of the sayings we have in Hadith that there will be a revival every 100 years, um, who will come and revive and restart this cycling of sorts. Um, a mujaddid of sorts will come. So this notion of time itself, this nature of time, and this is the ontological aspect. The time of Europe and time of the rest of the world, the time of Quran is very different in that sense, and it uses these tools to basically create this dyad of developing, and underdeveloped. What is also other interesting aspects is, of course, most of us would know that Europe also had Spain. Spain had Andalus in its previous avatar, and the influence is so much that even today, 8% of all Spanish words have Arabic roots. I mean, kahwa is one of them, which comes from Arabic roots, and many such words are still defined by this history. And there have been also other scholarship. Again, I've not read much, but what I've heard in a cursory fashion is that even Renaissance in Europe was impacted by the golden age that happened in the Muslim world at the same time that dark ages were happening in Europe. So let's come at some broad conclusions that we can draw, and these will not be the only ones, there may be more. That first of all, liberalism is a very particular European experience. It's born there, and it was influenced by new ways of knowing about the world. It was born out of a new epistemic place. It was born out of a new sources of knowing about the world. For example, as I said, the pre-modern world was seen as enchanted, a place connected with the higher self, and we needed revelation to know about the world and the self, and how to be and who to be and where to go in this world. Enlightenment prioritized reason and experience as a way of knowing. It grew skeptical of tradition in the same way it grew skeptical of any metaphysical claims, and it grew skeptical of taking revelation as a source of knowledge and a source of law, for example. It changed the nature of authority. We entered into a different form of governance, and I think Professor Hallaka has written much about this new form of governance, which is the nation state, which was previously in Europe, kings with divinely given rights, which of course also there was a lot of corruption that happened, which led to the entire Enlightenment movement itself. Although this transition led to the emergence of nation and citizen who now have social contract, for example. And of course, liberalism is dependent upon secularism because it's only in the divorcing of life from scripture, of relegating this scripture to a personal sphere, that liberalism is able to fill this void by presenting alternate ways of being, and where man is born with a clean slate and can make his own choices. The author tries to be as comprehensive and really trying to encompass various notions of liberalisms and various understanding. And he does that by really looking at key actors who have been definitive in defining those strands of liberalism as a way of studying. And he says that it's a very tricky subject to really confine because nobody can for sure say this is what liberalism is, but he tries the best way, and he builds a methodology of going to the key actors and definitive actors to arrive at certain frames or certain definitions. Of course, he builds up on a lot of scholarship that he cites as well for the same. Before we go there, let's just reflect on what is liberalism today. I think liberalism, I found this quote by Professor Ovimir Ranjum very, very powerful. I think it's a very strong thing to reflect for us, for ourselves as well, where he says that liberalism is difficult to define not because it's obscure, but because it's too familiar. It's a system of ideas and attitude, which means it's non-cerebral instinct, a preference, and a condition. It shapes the structures of our desire. It's the air we breathe in, it's the water we swim in. That is, it prevails in institutions and habits through technology, despite being defeated intellectually. So you can have this discussion, and you may arrive intellectually at this place that, hey, you know what, this is where, or this is so farcical, and it has, very loose basis of drawing its notions of rights and laws on top of it, so on and so forth. But so much is the entrenchment that it is almost inescapable, despite all your understanding that you must arrive at yourself. And I found that there's a very, very potent way of reflecting on what are we really engaging with as a topic today. Some of the core values, again, these are not explicitly mentioned, but I try to just draw them out from what I read in the book. The two key ones are autonomy and individualism, or liberty and individualism. Autonomy is a very interesting etymology. It gives away the spirit of liberalism very strongly. It means self-governance, which means I give myself laws, which is what liberalism really does. Is by disenchanting uh, the revelation and breaking away from revelation and God-given laws. Now man is free to choose how he how he wants to be lead his life, and he's free to choose his ways of being, as long as no other is harmed. So of course the utilitarian principle is also cited in how he conducts him. In this autonomy is engaged with the public, the other autonomy at large as well. It also frees man from any collectivity, whether it's communism, family. Again, we are seeing maybe a second, third order effect of this in breaking of traditional family systems, so on and so forth. The other two are more to do with how we arrive at certain laws, which is public reason, which is very interesting, where it says that, hey, you can discuss whatever you want. If you want the other to be convinced about your ways of being, make sure you include the other in convincing, because you are now in a plural society. So you cannot just say, hey, this is my law and this is because of my reasons, my revelation, therefore you must also not do it. You can't do that anymore. Not to say that, I'm not saying whether that's not desirable to convince the other, but the modes in which you can convince the other is also defined in this public reason. I think we'll learn about that when we go downwards. And human rights. Now man has human rights, which are inalienable, so much so that even God can't take them away. And we can only arrive at those rights through reason itself. We don't need revelation anymore to arrive at such rights. Even though I think what we learn down the line is also without the Christian aping of the Christian values, you couldn't have arrived at such conclusions. So you were the man did. The original actor, with the thinker who defined or gave way for these human rights was John Locke. And he himself made these arguments basis that there is God, and God created man. God also created laws of nature. And it was through those laws of nature that he assessed through reason that they were human rights. Even though the assessment is made in that way, the premise is that, but that premise is not needed anymore beyond that itself to prove at this arrival. What are the types of liberalisms? There are broadly two types. One is comprehensive, and the second is political liberalism. Comprehensive liberalism is saying not only will organize our political structures in a liberal fashion, which is say we'll have democratic institutions, but also we will have a certain conception of a good life, which means that we will cherish the European ideals, European Enlightenment ideals of rationality, individual freedom, scrutiny of tradition, skepticism, and a particular epistemology, which is more scientific and experiential and not really reliant on any revelatory basis for ways of being in the world. A more, I would say, extreme version the author cites is perfectionist liberalism, where it really says that this is definitely the way everybody should be, and so much so is the drive that if this liberty is only for the enlightened, if you're not enlightened, then there is imperialism for you, for example, and you will be governed by us, the enlightened, unless you also become liberal in your, or you also gain this inner liberty, or you arrive at the same conclusions as we have about rationality being supreme and the other values that we have, the Europe has mentioned for us to be taken up.
Real quick, have you changed the slide?
I have. I'm on types of liberalism.
We see liberal values as the slide, so.
Okay. Has it changed yet, or you want me to switch off my camera? Maybe I can do that.
Maybe
yeah, can you see it now?
Now try switching back and forth to see if we can.
I'm switching back and forth now.
So You should be in the slide mode, I think, not on the actual presentation, if that's what you're doing.
No, I'm on the slide mode. I've lost the slides now. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen. Maybe reshare it or something. Yeah, maybe reshare it.
Yes.
Maybe reshare it, please. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see the Google documents. Yeah, I can see slides.
Yes.
Okay. Just yeah, I'm not seeing the chat. So if at all it's not working, I we can just pass on the presentation. Please let me know.
Yeah, types of liberalism we are seeing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are, as I was saying, there were broadly two types of liberalisms: comprehensive and perfectionist. Perfectionist was a more extreme version, which even supported colonialism. And this is Condorcet who said this, by the way, and James Mill. Condorcet was that's where I think the Condorcet's paradox. He was a mathematician and an enlightenment thinker who mentioned about, acceptance of imperialism upon those savages who are not enlightened yet. And real autonomy is when good choices should be available and bad ones should be eliminated. Now, how do we know what these good choices are? They must have a liberal ethos of sorts. Again, I think I would love you to read the book itself because I'm not doing justice to how much detail the book carries. But broadly, this is the conclusion which it arrives at. On the other end, political liberalism tries to free itself from this particular conceptions of good, or is trying to really solve the problem. Hey, there may be other societies which may not be, let's say, socially liberal. These are religious societies like India or any other, the Muslim world, for example. So how might we create a political structure which can still, be relevant institutionally? So they may still be a liberal democracy, and where we can still allow the local culture or local ways of being to be present in defining and self-governing themselves. That's the broad claim of political liberalism, where it tries to be a value-less, neutral political framework, although the author exemplifies through various examples that he cites in the book that political liberalism is also comprehensive. And we'll see it's just that instead of talking about certain conceptions of good, it changes the way you can arrive at those conceptions. And that's another way of restricting the same. And there are a couple of examples we cite. We'll talk about that as well. Please tell me if you can see the slide change.
Yeah.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So political liberalism claims to be limited to political institutions, login frameworks, or method through which we can arrive at law. It claims that if a society has their own understanding of good, which is not in line with comprehensive liberalism, as long as they can justify it through public reason, then you should be able to convert them into laws of self or governing yourself, for example. So let's look at this from an example perspective. If, for example, as a Muslim in a plural society, you want to get alcohol banned, you are free to do so. There's no restriction. It doesn't matter what source you arrive at this banning, the need to ban from, as long as you have consensus, cares really about inclusiveness from the other. But you cannot really give a Muslim reason for banning alcohol. You cannot say Sharia says so or God says so, we must ban. You must say in this case that in such a language or such a reason that the other faith members also can accept. So you must say this you must be able to speak to the other faith members, which is an interesting way of framing this entire conversation. So it must be done to public reason, and this is what public reason is, that you're able to convince the other actors or the other participants in the society that this is a worthwhile consideration to make. So in more or less, it kind of leaves only one form of reasoning which can be acceptable. In more or less, it leaves only perhaps secular reasoning to be available or worldly reasons for people to arrive at laws through which they can govern. So even if you were to say alcohol is bad because God said so, and this is what you personally believe, the system forces you to be hypocritical in this way. Right? It forces you to arrive at a secular reasoning for your revelation-based reasoning, for example, to convince the other. And he cites the example in the book of the debates on abortion laws, right? The abortion laws were not discussed, as I previously indicated, on the basis of it should be banned because the Bible says so. It was defined in terms of pro-life versus pro-choice, and this is what public reason is broadly about. Is able to really frame the field within which the conversation is going to engage. Um, and there are different forms of it. I think we'll go through that in the data slides. But first of all, it's not a single fixated ideology. It's a living ideology, so it has been evolving. It makes general claims about what is good, but it doesn't concern itself with the contents necessarily. Islam, for example, aims to create a condition in which spiritual excellence and closeness to the Creator can be attained. It both gives the means and the ends to achieve as well, which is not necessarily the case. Liberal values are positive, but what do you do with that freedom? What do you do with that autonomy? What do you do with the liberty? That's never really concerned with in the liberal framework, so to speak. Of course, just to recall, liberal thinkers historically justified colonizing. While again, comprehensive liberalism makes claim about what are the values that are worth embodying, political liberalism, in the name of pluralism, simply restricts the process through which the values are arrived at. So there's different ways of perhaps arriving at similar, if not the same, conclusions, so to speak. Any other critical bit is about sovereignty itself. Like liberalism gives authority to society and nothing above. That we ourselves will give ourselves laws. We ourselves will create our own norms to how we govern ourselves. And that's the fundamental distinction from Islam per se. Let's look at moral epistemology, that is broadly saying how do we know what is moral, and how did our human rights arrived at as well in the liberal framework. So this was the broad argument that is being used that has still become the basis, and even if the liberalism posited by Locke is not the same liberalism that stays or sits today, but this argument, this foundation still remains unchanged in terms of man having inalienable rights, for example. Now, Locke claims that morality ultimately transcends God, and it's a very, very important aspect to really consider in this entire framework. And this is also one of the ontological differences, that God himself could not choose what is not good. It's as if he's determined by what is best. It's as if good and bad is above God, and God is bound by those. And funny enough, even the Mu'tazilites, which was a deviant rationalist thinkers influenced by Greek philosophy in the times of Imam Ahmad, had made similar arguments, where they said that there is real good and real justice, and which God uploads, and man can know these through reason. Until here it could be okay, but eventually they also said that God is bound by this good, real justice and real good, which is where they really restrict God's omnipotence. On the other hand, of course, Islam, as this group may very well know, is that knowledge of what is just and good requires revelation. That we only know what is good, what is bad through revelation, in a way. And that revelation and reason cannot be divorced in Islamic moral epistemology. Like if there was a contradiction, either our reasoning is wrong or interpretation of revelation is incorrect. And of course, there are several examples within our fiqh tradition in terms of how we are using reason to ascertain revelation more appropriately. In case there's no near approximation of what is directly available, we use things like qiyas or an analogous referencing of ayahs to arrive at a certain conclusions. And one of the examples could be, how do we know if cigarette is haram or if it's halal? There's no direct revelation really citing it, so we use qiyas to say, hey, having cigarette means that it causes you personal harm. it's akin to killing yourself. Killing yourself is haram, therefore this must also be haram. So it uses a reason, it looks as revelation and uses reason to arrive at certain conclusions which may not be directly accessible, but holistically available in the revelation itself. And last but not least is that all knowledge, including of good and justice, exists within Allah's will. That God is not constrained by anything independent of His will. And if there is any restraint that God has put upon Himself, God is free to remove this constraint that He's put by Himself upon Himself. And this notion of God itself and capacity of God is what is shifting in the moral epistemology of liberalism, for example. Now let's look at human rights and what is the basis for human rights. Now, of course, we are seeing human rights are universal, they're accepted by all nations almost, and every second day or third day we kind of hear, hey, this nation has, curtailed or breached certain human rights, so on and so forth. This foundational argument for human rights does come from Locke, even if some of the positions Locke took have been, I would say, are not acceptable in today's terms. Things around women's rights and stuff like that the ideas Locke had would not be acceptable in today's time. But his broad proposition from which it builds actually is a believer's argument, at least to begin with. At least the first statement that God is created by man, and God has created natural law through which man can govern himself. And the second bit, and this is one of the critical bits, of these natural laws can be ascertained through reason. So you may not need revelation to arrive at these laws. That through reason, through rationality, you can arrive at those conclusions of what God has given as laws for us to govern ourselves. And in fact, he places a greater weightage upon reason than revelation in this entire process. This basic argument is actually a Christian. It's based on a Christian argument in a way. At least the first statement that it's a Christian belief that he borrows from is what some of the other scholars who the author cites have mentioned about this as well, where he tries to fit the biblical teachings within this liberal framework to justify his position, his position in that. And in fact, some of the other liberal thinkers like Leo Strauss claim that the real purpose of Locke was to dissociate God from law. And the reason some of these other thinkers cite that John Locke spoke in this language because he was living in a time which was very tumultuous for people who think otherwise, people who think in other ways that the church doesn't like. And if the church doesn't like you, it is okay to just chop your head or put you under the guillotine and not worry about you anymore, which happened with a lot of scientists of the times as well in the Dark Ages. So some of the arguments have been that Locke was just trying to appease the times, but his real intention was, God knows best what was the real intention, but at least that's some of the claims made by the subsequent liberal thinkers about Locke's position and his real intention. Broadly speaking, liberalism limits the role of God publicly, even if it uses revelation as a crutch to justify and beginning its project. It limits both God's omnipotence and His will. And by right, and this is again the third statement is also very, very, very critical as well. By not adhering to a revealed definitions of man can be defined in sync with desires of man. It allows for an unfixed, unhinged definition of humanity. So what is interesting here is that the author cites I think the Iranian thinker Ali Shorosh, I think, if I'm getting his name correct, where he says that the trick of the devil here is that in not defining what humanity itself is. Humanity, which was very clearly defined as servants of God, at least let's say in the Islamic paradigm. One would assume it's a similar paradigm that Christians would also have, maybe subjects of God, so to speak. Now, man is free from God. What humanity really is can be a flexible definition, a fluid definition. And a fluid definition of humanity would mean that there's a fluid human rights that lays on top. You could also perhaps, if you want to make a very loose argument for how come we as a society were not okay, the same West was not okay with gays gay marriages being publicly acceptable versus why it has become acceptable. Perhaps one of the things that has happened is not just on the law level of the law itself. It's also how what we define as humanity at large, and some definitions of um, uh, the foundational definitions of what we are accepting and not accepting in these kind of conversations and debates. Now, the other area of comparison has been role of religion in public sphere, and he cites a couple of key um, uh, intellectuals to really discuss the positions of liberalism at least. The first one is John Rawls, which I mentioned, talks about public reason, that religion can be allowed in public sphere as long as it's subjected to secular reason, or you subject it to public reason, which is acceptable by the other religiosities, so to speak. And I didn't really bother about what the ruling was. You want hijab, take it. Convince the other person. So consensus was prime. So that if so for him inclusion was key, and to arrive at inclusion, consensus was necessary. And as long as you're able to convince the other of the same, then so be it. You can have that. The other actor is Habermas. Habermas, he says religion can be allowed in public sphere so long as it can be modernized. And this is very interesting. What are the 3 pointers that he lays out? And it sets conditions for modernizing. The first one is it should find parity with other religions and give up claims to exclusive truths. I mean, at least the second part of the first statement is antithetical to Islam. Islam starts with La ilaha. There is no God. It's negation first, and then affirmation but there is one God, the one true God, which the Habermas's position tries to just denounce and almost dismantle, so to speak. The second, he says, is progress in secular knowledge cannot contradict faith. And that has never been the case in Islamic history, right? We've had scientific flourishing in the Islamic golden age, where we had a Muslim government, Sharia was part of the society, on the ground, in the government systems, and we saw flourishing of astronomy, mathematics, and all kinds of knowledge flourishing in those moments. The third is also that they fit within frameworks of modern law and morality. Now, how can and this is very close to public reasoning almost, right? That, hey, whatever you can care about, you care about. But as long as you can fit within this modern law and morality framework, which can be accepted by the other, you're okay. For example, you can do whatever you want, but you must also accept this new morality of allowing for LGBT marriages to happen, or giving it mainstream platform, and so on and so forth. And this is almost, again, it's untenable because our epistemes are different. Our basis of knowing about morality is different. And since the way we know about what laws, the way we arrive at those laws is distinct, to try and reconcile that will be epistemic injustice in a way. And this, we have seen this example in today's time, right, where the argument of hijab, the birth of, in the downfall of the Mughal and the onset of autumn of the British Empire, we see the introduction of Anglo-Mohammedan laws, where they're trying a prior imperialists who were previously just traders and now become governing entities. He's like, hey, how do I really deal with two Muslims fighting each other? And they create Anglo-Mohammedan law, which they just crassly try to codify Sharia into in the same way that English law is codified. Which, first of all, that's the initial injustice, because they just rely on, first of all, codification is not how Sharia, that's not the nature of Sharia itself. And second, the kind of translations they rely on is half-baked, broken, and they just try to mismatch. So they would take a 12-verse a law from 12-verse Shias, a Sunni and Shia law, and just combine them together in some cases, and just to create a new hodgepodge, a new animal which never existed almost, and call it Sharia, for example. So that was the beginning, even if they allowed for Muslim qadis to come and govern those matters eventually through this codified laws, so to speak. Cut to, we are in today's time where we're talking about the abrogation of, the discussion of hijab, and the fact that an untrained uh, Indian judicial uh, judge gets the right to investigate Quran and try to make fiqh claims about what is essential religious practice is another form of epistemic injustice that is happening, right? Where this actor, first of all, who doesn't understand what Sharia is not trained in it, is trying to do this gymnastic of sorts to arrive at a conclusion, uh, which is absolutely, of course, the conclusion will always be totally alien, not just the conclusion, but the method itself is totally alien to how is what will be acceptable for us, for example. So, what are the liberal and Islamic approaches to law? And this section is very technical, and I would love that you go through and read the book and understand this in a very detailed fashion. And it's best if scholars of law can pick this up, because I found this a little tricky for me to navigate. But broadly speaking, there are broad outlines which we can very easily grasp, and I will talk about that today. First of all, liberal law is amoral. It doesn't make any claims for right and wrong. If it's a law, that's how we see it. Is it legal or illegal? That's the primary, objective of liberal law. It's trying to arrive at legalities. While Islamic laws seek to understand what is good and be and acceptable to Allah, that is the foundational difference, is morality in these spheres. And if you want to really deep delve further on this, you must read Professor Halak's Impossible State, which really draws the contrast out very powerfully. Liberal law only creates boundaries by framing what is legal and illegal. But I think in Sharia, it's far more expansive. It's fard, mustahab, mubah, makruh, and haram. So between what is obligatory to achieve nearness to Allah, to what is acceptable but not fard, to mubah, that, I mean, theek hai, aap kar sakte ho, there's a neutrality about it, to makruh, it accept, I mean, for example, you can have prawns, that's makruh in some fiqh positions that we have, and in some places it's haram. So it's a very broader categorization of law itself beyond legality itself. And it's not legality to no end, it's legality with a particular end, to which is a virtuous end, that we eventually achieve nearness of God. And it's broadly aims to enjoin good and forbid bad. Whereas liberal laws can be remade by man, and this man can keep evolving as well. This notion of who man is and who can he be is an evolving criteria. So whatever new man the man becomes, the liberal laws also kind of evolve with this new man. Whereas Sharia is somewhat fixated. It's fixated by revelation. It's anchored by revelation, and it's, of course, it has a very generative aspect to it that you can innumerably keep interpreting to arrive at modern contexts solutions, for examples. So I'll broadly stop here. I think if there are any questions, concerns, we'll be able to take it up, inshallah.
We have Brother Imran, he raised his hand, so inshallah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Jazakallah khairan for the presentation.